let's start with one of my favorite questions for myself and from you for you, because I saw you talking about the matter. I saw at least one conference where you were talking about this, and it's the human nature. Let's
Hmm.
start by just telling me, do you think there's such thing as human nature?
The short answer is that I do. The the so I think it's worth thinking about why this is. Before I answer the question, it's worth thinking about why this is can be such a controversial question amongst people who want to change the system, change the world, make the world a better place. I think the reason that people find it a controversial question is because they think that if we say there is such a thing as a human nature, it implies that the world will be very difficult to change because they think it implies that the reason we have the world we live in is because we have the kinds of humans that we have, and therefore there's very little that we can do about the world and to change it. And I think that the conclusion and the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. So, in other words, I think it is possible to stipulate that there is such a thing as a human nature, but also retain the view that it should be possible to change society. The reason that is
Mhm.
the case is, in fact, I want to say something a little bit stronger. That would be the weak version of my argument. I think the strong version of my argument is that, in fact, if you want to change the world, it is very difficult and maybe impossible to really make a case for doing so unless you believe in a human nature. So that's the strong version of my argument. But maybe let me defend the weak version first, and then I'll defend the strong version. So the weak version is the claim that uh, there's no connection between the view that there is a human nature, there is a such thing as a human nature, and that the society is very difficult to change. And that's simply because it depends entirely on what you take human nature to consist in. So when people look at the world outside, they infer that humans are selfish, competitive, greedy, violent, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's fair to say that we see evidence of those kinds of impulses. But I think when you look at the world around us, you also see impulses that are very different from that. You see people being caring, you see people being generous, you see people being altruistic, you see a lot of examples of humans behaving differently than the kind of bourgeois view of human nature. So even just empirically looking around us, we see evidence of a more complicated human nature than the selfish vision that some people might defend. So that's kind of the way that I would defend the weak claim, because if that's true, it seems possible that we could construct a society based not on simply the selfish, competitive, greedy elements, but we could construct a society based on the more beautiful things in human nature. I think that there's no reason to believe that's not possible. But I want to defend a stronger version. I think the stronger version of my argument makes sense of why we think human nature, why we think the world is unfair without committing to something like a view of human nature. By that, I mean, when you and I look at the world and we say that how unfair it is that people are exploited, how unfair it is that certain people don't have food to eat, how unfair it is that certain people don't have homes to live in. The only way it really makes sense to argue that, I think, is if you say that these people about whom we're talking must themselves have an interest in being fed, in having a home, in having healthcare, in having education. So we're imputing to people certain interests, certain unshakable objective interests. That only makes sense, I think, if you impute to them a certain kind of human nature. Human nature makes possible, another way of putting it, human nature makes possible sympathy. It makes possible the claim that I share something that you share, and so I can understand your experience. And I think without that kind of understanding, it's very difficult to do qualitative argument. That reason too, we should believe that there is such thing as human nature.
I understand what you mean, and I partially agree with you, especially because every Marxist anthropologist will probably agree with you as well. But at the same time, I think there's a fallacy in that argument, which is thinking that the human is selfish and that the human only wants the good for himself. I mean, and where is the fallacy? The fallacy is when you analyze the human history, and the human history, not in the history of civilization, but the human history as a species. you can see that for the most time, for the most history, we have been communal animals, and we have been communal as a species, and we have progressed from being like primitive humans to a more advanced human society by being communal. And even in time of crisis, you can see that in some irrational level, when we don't know what to do, we begin constructing commons, and we live in commons. And you can see that after the fall of the Roman Empire, where the city-states of Milan, Venezia, all of that city-states, they basically become a common, because in a state of crisis, it's what they thought it was better to do. Same thing can apply to a difference for revolutionary France, for example, a time of chaos when during the terror, basically Paris created its own common. It wasn't the first time for sure. So it's a very tricky argument in that sentence, because if we analyze the question of human nature, I think it benefits the socialist view of the world more than the capitalist worldview.
That's interesting. I mean, I think that's very optimistic. I don't necessarily disagree with you that we look through human history. If we look through human history in the way that you're describing, you've given some very good examples of human beings behaving cooperatively, altruistically. But I do think we have to take seriously the counter evidence that there are also many examples of humans behaving selfishly and violently and greedily. So that's not, I don't think necessarily we're disagreeing, but I do think it's a little too easy to say that human history simply supports a one-sided view of human nature. And
No, definitely.
if only capitalism would get out of the way, we'd have a utopian society.
Definitely.
I think we have to figure out what is it, what are the kinds of institutions, what are the kinds of structures that would support the better parts of human nature that both you and I agree exist.
Actually goes right to the next question I wanted to ask you, because in this conversation we just admitted that there is examples for both sides of the argument, that there's human nature that demonstrates we are socialists and human nature that demonstrates we're capitalists. And my question is, isn't that controversy a good argument in favor that there's no such thing as human nature?
Interesting. No, I don't think so. I see what you're saying, that in other words, if it's the case that human nature is so plastic, so malleable, it can change so much, isn't it the case that there's no such thing as human nature, and because human nature can be anything? I think that's not exactly right. I think the way to think about it is that there's sort of a distribution of behaviors that are human, and the shape of that distribution can change a little bit, but there are some fixed properties across place and time. You know, for instance, it's a simple requirement that human beings need a certain amount of food to reproduce themselves. It's a simple requirement that human beings need everywhere to have probably some kind of shelter over their heads, or need to be protected from the elements. There are these kinds of things that I think are impossible, that are just constants in the human experience. I think if you deny that, I'd like to hear what you would make of the stronger argument I was making, which is, if we think there is no such thing as certain basic human objective interests, by which I mean something like a human nature, then why do we care if people go hungry? Why do we care if people go without shelter? Why do we care if people go without healthcare? What do you think about that?
And that's a very good argument, actually, and I actually need to think about it. There's such questions, but at the surface level.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I will say that, yeah, but everything that comes to mind basically demonstrates that there is such thing as human nature. So yeah, at this moment, probably with your strong argument, I cannot say nothing about, and I totally agree with you. Although I admit that I'm strongly biased in favor of not believing that there is such thing as human nature, because in reality it's really a liberating sensation to think that there's no such thing as human nature.
I agree. That's right, and it can feel like a very constraining feeling to believe the opposite. But I just think, I mean, one thing that I'm responding to, which maybe is not something that you encounter too much, is a certain kind of cultural relativism, which I encounter in the university here in the United States, which is the idea that certain desires that human beings have are Western capitalist desires, like the desire for a certain standard of living or the desire for a certain kind of healthcare, something like that, and that people elsewhere don't have.
Do you have that desire in the US?
Sorry?
You have that desire? You have the desire for healthcare in the US?
Of course. Yeah, of course.
Sorry, I just...
Yeah. No, I know.
Just try to understand that for us Europeans, it's kind of fascinating that there's such a developed Western country, and this country doesn't have free healthcare for all its individual.
Yeah, that's right. But I worry sometimes that maybe the US shows an image of Europe's future to Europe.
You really think that?
No, I don't actually think that. I think the world is getting better in many ways. But I do think that there are certain things emerging in Europe's political economy that would give me concern. No?
Definitely. But at the same time, there's a very strong left movement emerging in Europe this time. And that's really makes me happy. And for sure, they're not they're not perfect anyway. But still, it shows that we'll talk about this later because I really want to talk about socialism with you and this gonna. Yeah. So let's get to the next question that I got here, which is the myths about human nature. Because you as a scholar and many of your research, you probably have come across a lot of myths about human nature and how it's used by the current system in a very harmful way against us, the society.
Yeah, well, I think we kind of touched on this in the very first question that you asked, which is that I think in general, the way in which some people tend to defend the kind of world that we currently live in, a world which is highly inegalitarian, in which the society is structured around very unequal incentives for people to in the labor market. I think people tend to justify that by saying that this is the only kind of society that is compatible with human nature, because humans are selfish, gain-seeking, care only about themselves and maybe their loved ones, and so there is no other kind of world possible. That's the kind of argument that I think people make. That's the specific most harmful myth, let's say, about human nature for people like you and me. But I think was the second part of the question, why is that wrong?
No, actually, the only one question was about how is it harmful to like everyday lives?
I think it's harmful to everyday lives in that it's part of the ideology of the world in which we live. It's part of the ideology that seeks to stabilize this social order and seeks to make it more difficult for us to transition to another one. I also think I'm not sure if you would agree, but I think it's something that many people believe about the world that we live in, because it's part of the ruling ideology. And so in that sense, it's an obstacle to making the world a better place.
Okay, so let's get to the next one. I'm kind of want to get
the. That was an easy question, then.
Yeah, that was definitely an easy question. It kind of because you gave me a limited time, so now I know that I cannot just sit here and talk to you and say everything I want to, just because I want to get the most of it.
Yeah.
But still, let's go to the next one. So the next one it's kind of it will be a little bit more complicated, and you asked for it, which is the notion of good and evil. Do you think at this time and in history in 2020, then our notion as a society of good and evil is more harmful or not?
It's a super interesting question. I think I think I'll have to approach it in two steps. So the first step is to say that I think the concepts themselves are incoherent. I do believe that. I'm someone who tends to believe that there probably isn't such a thing as free will. And so given that there can't be such a thing as good and evil in one specific sense, in other words, there can't be, it doesn't really make sense to say person X is good or person Y is evil. That doesn't make sense. But having said that, I do also think that it is possible to use those adjectives to describe social arrangements or to describe states of affairs. So while it's not coherent to say person A is evil, it is coherent to say society A is evil or society B is evil. So in that sense, I think the concept of good and evil depend. I suppose maybe the summary, my summary answer is that it depends on whether we're applying these adjectives, these normative judgments, to humans or to states of affairs and societies. If it's the former, then I think it's incoherent, and if it's incoherent, it can't really be helpful at some level. But on the other hand, if we're applying these adjectives to societies, to states of affairs, it's coherent, and in fact, it's necessary if we want to change society. Because the only way in which it makes any sense to want to change society is if you think that society is not good and that some other state of affairs would be better.
That's very interesting, and I have two questions that arise from your statement. The first one is about free will. There are many types of free will, and usually free will, when somebody says there's no such thing as free will, is usually pretty bad seen in a society, in our society. But still,
what do you mean by that?
I mean, we're getting back to the original question of human nature. I mean, it really attacks your own ego to truly believe that there's no such thing as free will.
That's right.
And in that way, the majority of us and the majority of society, I mean, doesn't easily accept the fact that there's no such thing as free will. But still, even if there's no such thing as free will, and this is my opinion, I believe that yes, there's no such thing as free will, but at the same time, you're conditioned by your materialistic state. What does it mean? It means that your materialistic environment gives you two choices, A and B. And the thing is, you don't have free will because there's nothing beyond those two choices. All your environment brought you to the choosing between those two. And this, I mean, this in my head doesn't make a controversy with the fact that there's no free will. Do you agree with that?
Well, but are you suggesting that your hypothetical person still has a choice between A and B, even though they don't have the choice of C, D, E, F, G? Do they have the choice between A and B?
To some extent, yes. I don't.
If that's the case, then I think you've salvaged a conception of free will, which is to say, I don't think anyone could deny, even philosophers who defend the concept of free will, that there are a whole host of ways in which our social environment and our material circumstances restrict our choices. I don't think anyone would deny that, say, options X, Y, Z are off the table. But if someone has a meaningful choice between A and B, then it seems to me
the thing is that it doesn't. The fact that you have a choice doesn't make it meaningful. That's the point I'm not trying to make. That's my view.
Yeah, that's fair. So I mean, the way that I would put the point is that, in some sense, given that we're materialists, it has to almost be the case that whether or not a person is the kind of person who would choose A over B has also been decided already for us.
And the first example, that makes sense. In the first, but I like to exemplify things, and I was trying to think about an example. But I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there's a theory of revolution, which says that revolution is inevitable, and we have all our revolution histories can be translated in revolution. We have passed from one state of socioeconomic to another through revolution. And there was a passage between the Roman Empire, which was a slave owner state, to feudalistic state. And the thing is, the Roman Empire lasted a lot, much more than it should be last. Maybe the choices that they make salvage them for a little bit more. And you understand what I mean? So basically, they just prolonged the suffering of the empire for a little bit more longer. But in the end, it didn't matter, because in a big historical perspective, the choice just didn't matter, because in the end, the empire collapsed anyway. So that's basically what I'm trying to say here. I don't know if that was clear or not.
That's an interesting. No, that is clear. That's an interesting argument. I would have some more things to say about that specific example, but I don't think we should spend too much time, because it seems like we mostly agree about this,
Yeah.
and they're. I'm looking at your list of questions, and I see.
I don't want to look at that. So, but there's another question that arises from the notion of good and evil. If there is no such thing as free will or good and evil, is it correct to put somebody in prison?
Yeah, so that's the kind of thing that I was thinking about as well. So it depends on your view of what the purpose of punishment is, right? So if you think that the purpose of punishment is to hold people to account for bad behavior that they've done, then the absence of free will would mean that punishment can't be justified, because it would be incoherent to hold somebody responsible for something that they've done if we don't have a conception of free will. But that's not the only justification of punishment, of course. Another justification of punishment is that you punish people in order to deter bad behavior, in order to keep other people safe. So the first view of punishment is typically in English called retributivism. The second view of punishment is called consequentialism. And if you're a consequentialist about punishment, which is kind of utilitarian in its nature, if you say that the purpose of punishment is to keep other people safe, then it can be coherent to punish people, even if they haven't done those acts willfully. It can be simply because you want to keep the people who they might further harm safe. And also if you think it's justified to set an example by punishing a person, to punish them in order to prevent other people from being incentivized to commit a crime. So that view of punishment can tend towards quite harsh outcomes, but I think there's no necessary reason for it to be harsh. And that's generally the view of punishment that I find most compelling.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Just a side note, there's a very interesting French thinker, Michel Foucault.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with his book about prison and punishment? In English, it's called Discipline and Punishment. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And he argues that punishment it's only about power, and the government exerting its own power. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. I don't agree with that. I think that the history of punishment is no doubt partly the history that he's describing, a history of power and the state consolidating itself. There's no doubt that that is part of what is happening. And there are other aspects of his argument that I think are very compelling. But I also think that another important aspect of the history of punishment and policing, which typically radical left-wing analyses of punishment, either in the Foucault tradition or in the Marxist tradition, that they generally ignore, is that the other aspect of the demand for prisons and police and punishment in the history of capitalism has come from the working class. As difficult as it is maybe to make that argument, I think that it's true. In general, capitalism creates inequality, instability, poverty, and crime. And the primary victims of that crime historically have been members of working class, members of the oppressed. And so it's entirely understandable that those same members would seek from the state, they would seek protection from crime and violence. And I think that's part of the history of capitalism and punishment under capitalism as well.
It's interesting, but the only question that arises from that is that at the same time, if that's true, why does the punishment only works downside? And what I mean by that is, why do we constantly see, let's say, bourgeois elite doing crimes against the rest of society, and they can and they do get punished from that?
Yeah. Well, I think that is because, as I was arguing, punishment, the use of punishment and police by society is not exclusively a function of what the working class wants. Power matters a lot because this is ultimately something that the state does, and the state is not some kind of entity that sits above society. The state is something that is generally staffed by bourgeois elites and something that bourgeois elites have a lot of influence over. So the nature of punishment, you can think of this as there being kind of two filters or two sources of pressure that determine the nature of punishment. One being the power of elites and the power of entrenched interests, but the other being the voice of the working class. I think that has also shaped the nature of state power over the last 100 and 150 years. I think that's the only way one can also, to take a more general example, that's the only way one can make sense of really the reason that we now have democracy, where 150, 200 years ago we had autocracies everywhere. The reason that we've had democracy is because the state is not simply the plaything of bourgeois elites. It's also something that the working class is able to shape and transform through collective action and building popular movements. And so there's no reason that the same thing shouldn't be true of punishment.
There is a very interesting book. I'm sorry, but I cannot remember the name of the author. It's a female professor from some university. I remember the name of the book. The name of the book is Why Do Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism?
I've heard of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting book, but that's beside the point, because I think it was her that wrote a book about our democracy and the evolution of our welfare state and all of that. And one of the main points of her argue is that the reason why the US and all the, let's say, the Western world was evolving socially during the last century was because of the strong counterpoint of the USSR. So basically, that was the main reason why we got so many good things for the working class, why we got a better life expectancy for the middle class, and all the good things that happened to the poor. And her argument is that basically, first thing, it happened because of that during the time that USSR was an economic and a military power. And the second of her argument is, and of course, I want to just remind you that I'm oversimplifying, of course. The second part of her argument is that when that threat from the USSR ended, which was in the 90s, we started seeing the inverse happening. So we now came to 20 years later of the USSR fallen, and we see a gigantic increase in inequality overall, in some places more than all. We see the welfare state get reduced in almost everywhere, little by little. And so that's the point of sharing. That it wasn't the masses, and that's how I want to connect the two arguments, yours and hers. I don't believe that necessarily it was the will and the power of the people who made the better life for themselves. I mean, in that argument, I'll probably agree with her more than you. What do you think about that?
Interesting. So can I respond?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay, so here I think there's certainly something to that argument. It's an argument that Eric Hobsbawm, the British historian, also made in his History of the 20th Century. But I think one reason sitting in the United States to be skeptical of that argument is that if it were the case that it was the example of the USSR that civilized capitalism, then one has to ask, why is it the case that in the place where the example of the USSR was most used, the bogeyman of communism most denounced, why is it that in that place in the United States, we've seen the civilizing of capitalism happen the least? Why is it that the United States is so far left behind the rest of Europe, as you were saying earlier about healthcare? I think the better explanation of the US-Europe difference is, in fact, the thing I was describing earlier, and that you were describing earlier, which is the strength historically of the left and the labor movement in Europe relative to the United States. Because I think the communism hypothesis, the Soviet Union hypothesis, has difficulty making sense of why the US is so behind.
And actually, that gets me to one of my questions that I have for you, which is, do you still feel the consequences of McCarthyism in the United States today?
McCarthyism? You mean like by McCarthyism, do you mean the fact that the historically that it's been difficult to be a socialist or a communist?
I mean the direct propaganda and direct persecution and imprisonment of communist members in the United States.
I see. No, today I don't at all in the United States, and I think it's for a sad reason, which is that the left in the United States is both very, very weak and also very disconnected from the working class. I mean, the left is basically today, especially the far left, not the mainstream left, but the far left is disproportionately composed of people who are of the what some people call the professional managerial class, people like me. And if the left is people like me, then unfortunately, I think the left has very little hope of changing society, and therefore elites don't really think about the left at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're not worth repressing, if that makes sense. Which was very different. It was very different 60 years ago.
No, it was. For example, when studying the matter, I was astonished that the first black vice president that ever he didn't got to the government, but he candidated himself. The government was a communist, was a black person from a communist party in the 30s. So there was a really strong.
I don't know who that is.
I can find and I will because I have his propaganda poster from the 30s. I can email that poster to you if you want.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and
yeah.
And it was really strong. I mean, democratism itself was one of the things that I discovered.
Yeah, they were.
And why? First of all, why do I ask you this question? Because the majority of people that got fired and got to prison, and there weren't the majority, but a big portion, were professors. And basically,
yes.
I wanted to understand if today is okay to be a communist, or I don't know. First of all, are you a socialist communist? Is it good? How to describe yourself?
No, I don't really. I don't really use the label. I haven't really thought too hard about those labels, to be honest. I mean, I used to think much harder about them when I was younger, but I think now I basically just identify myself negatively rather than positively. I identify myself as being against the world that we live in. I think that the world that we live in is far too unequal. It can't be justified how unequal it is, and how asymmetric life chances are and power is. And so I think of myself as an egalitarian, as someone who thinks that the world should be much more equal than it is in terms of resources, wealth, power. But I don't really bother myself with labels just because it feels like it creates more controversy than it's worth. And I'm not very politically active. I'm just intellectually active. And so it doesn't seem worth it. I generally, I think of myself as, I guess, I would suppose I would call myself an egalitarian. And I think that encompasses socialism, communism, social democracy, a whole host of more equal forms. And I don't know which to commit to beyond that.
Okay. That's more than fair. In other time, I'll even agree with you. But at this moment, it's a conversation for another time. Let's continue. The next part of your answer, probably a few months ago, I will totally agree with you, but you say that the far left right now it's too much intellectuals. Let's put it in that very easy way.
Yeah.
My profession, too much thinkers. But at this point, I totally disagree with you. And I totally disagree with you for mainly one reason, and this happened really recently. I discovered a really good, really well made podcast channel, which is Revolutionary Left Radio. I don't know if you have heard it, probably not, because it's really small. But it was really fascinating to hear him talk about really interesting issues. And not only he doesn't talk about like literal politics, he talks about more Marxist theory, and he talks about different historical events through the lens of Marxist. I think he's a Marxist-Leninist. And then after him, I discovered another bunch of small, let's put that, small podcasts. And the thing is, I discovered that all of them are normal people from the from the, let's say, the working class. For me, that was fascinating because it destroyed, destroyed that label in me. Because for the long time, I always thought that we must approach carefully the people, the normal people, not give them right away to the Marxist theory and all of that. And now I start thinking differently. It's like, no, probably it's wrong to treat in that way, because if we treat the people that way, maybe we make them out of them stupid. Maybe they feel that and then they send that, and that's one of the reasons why they don't want to join us, because they don't feel authenticity from our part, because we are oversimplifying things. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I think there's something to what you're saying, I think, but what all I was referring to is the fact that the big organizations of which I'm aware of the far left in the United States, like the Democratic Socialists of America, the people around Jacobin magazine, these are that's sort of the universe that I know best. I don't know Revolutionary Left Radio and other people. I'm sure there might be many other organizations that I'm not very aware of. That's not something that I am particularly familiar with. The people that I know are drawn disproportionately from what we call the professional managerial class. And then I've also recently, I'm not sure if you have read Capital and Ideology, the recent book by Thomas Piketty, but
no.
in Capital and Ideology, Thomas Piketty proposes the concept of the Brahmin left and shows that over the last 50, 60 years in the Western world, there's been this rise of what he calls the Brahmin left, by which he means that previously the most educated people in society used to vote for the right and not for the left. They used to be more likely to vote for the right and not for the left. But that in almost all developed countries over the last 50, 60 years has flipped. It's also true in the United States, but in all developed countries. Today, the more educated people in society vote left and the less educated people in society vote right. And more educated, less educated is kind of a proxy for members of the kind of professional class and members of the working class. And so that shift has really concerned me, and it's something that I see in my own life. So that's what I was talking about. But it's certainly not to dispute the idea that there are many, what we might call like organic intellectuals, many people on the left who are also of the working class. I don't think that there's anything about professionals that makes them intrinsically more capable or something of being members of the left. I think it's about the collapse of the labor.
And I totally agree with you, because above all, I think Marxism is a populist movement. Marxism and the Communist Manifesto was a propaganda book above all, and that's why I think. And that's why I think it's not now. I think that's not complicated for the majority of people to understand and to align to that. Still, let's talk about why, in specific in your country, in America, the far right is much more popular than the far left, especially among the working class. Because we see all those Trump rallies. Usually, these are people like miners and people that are in the working class.
Yeah,
and they are complaining about big corporation and things like that should naturally predispose them to communism. But no, they talk about how everything's very corrupt, but still they go to the far right, which is kind of a paradigm, which is kind of nonsensical to me. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's a great question. But I think, I mean, let me say a few different things. I think the first thing to say is that it's important to recognize that in the United States, this has a racial element, I think. So when we're speaking about the working class voting or supporting the far right, we're really speaking mostly, I think, about the white working class, or at least disproportionately about the white working class. The white population is most of the working class in the United States, but it's not all of the working class. That's one thing I would say. And it's also maybe important to say that supporting the far right is not really probably the most common thing that the white working class has done. The white working class has also withdrawn from politics in large numbers, and that is also probably important to observe. But having said that, I think the reasons that the white working class supports in some numbers the far right is because what the far right offers is a defense of the privileges that this white working class has lost as the 1950s and 1960s model of capitalism changed into the 1990s and 2000s model of capitalism, which is that it lost stable working class jobs, which provided a family income and a decent livelihood for people without a college education. Those jobs have collapsed. The places that they supported have collapsed. And the far right promises them a return to the world that they once lived in. The left's job, obviously, is to speak to those same concerns that they have about the world that they've lost, but not to promise them a fantasy world that we can never really recover, but to promise them something new, and promise them something new in tandem with the rest of the working class, the non-white portions of the working class. That is a pattern, I would also say, that I think you see in other parts of the world. I think you see something like that in France and Italy, for example.
Even here in Portugal.
And in Portugal, you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I don't know. I mean, I would be curious to hear. You're much more politically engaged than I am, so I would trust your explanation over mine. But my explanation would be, something like the historically, we've had organizations that have helped people make sense of the world that they live in. These are trade unions and political parties. In the United States, you yourself were referring to the Communist Party in an earlier era in the United States. Trade unions were much stronger around that time as well. These are organizations that give people an alternative way of making sense of the world that they live in. Once those organizations collapse, then what are you left with? You're left with social media and people on mainstream media. And what better place for bourgeois ideology, I think, to circulate?
It's really interesting, fascinating, especially about that. You just mentioned a very interesting part is that the US had really higher numbers in unions in the 70s and the 60s than it has right now.
Much higher, much higher, yeah.
And that's fascinating to me. For me, at this moment, it's at least in my opinion, the far right movement, far right ideology is literally the best description of postmodernism.
Interesting. Say more.
They are really empty in their sides, and everybody can make out of them what they really want of it. Let's say even the big orange man in the US that still is there, and his words are really empty. He doesn't promise, doesn't make a concrete promise, and doesn't not only make a concrete promise, but doesn't fulfill those promises that he already made. So he's literally, in terms of ideology, he's empty. And once I saw in one of your interviews, you say that we are living a very dangerous time, because if at this moment appears a very strong ideological leader in the far right, we are screwed as a humanity. and I totally agree with you on that, because at this moment,
who said that?
I think it was you.
Oh no, I don't think I said that. That's interesting. I believe that, but I don't remember saying that. I do believe that though.
I'm almost sure it was you, because I catch this while making research on you and your past interviews.
Okay, I believe you. No, I think that's right. I think that they're, I suppose, it's not impossible to think that there could be a more competent, ideologically powerful leader to emerge, because I think the alternatives, which were alternatives that should be supplied by us, are really, unfortunately, I'm really happy to hear that you have hope about Portugal and about Europe, but in the United States, I feel quite a bit of despair.
It's sad.